Hello. Well, thank you for coming along. The Minister for Finance and myself today are releasing the final budget outcome for the last budget year of the Labor government. The final budget outcome for the last year of a Labor government is a deficit of $48.5 billion, in dollar terms the second biggest in Australian history. Last year, in his last budget, Wayne Swan promised a budget deficit of $18 billion. It ended up being $48.5 billion, a deterioration in excess of $30 billion. Of the $30 billion deterioration, 60% was from the write-down of receipts, and in particular tax receipts. This comes down to the fact that Labor continually overestimated the amount of tax that they would collect. They continually got it wrong. This is not a confected figure, it is the real numbers, what actually came into the budget. In relation to that, there were a number of miscalculations by the previous government, including in particular the failed mining tax, which was expected to raise around $700 million in 2013-14. It raised $100 million. Don't forget it was originally meant to raise $9 billion in its original form in that year. There were other policy decisions which accounted for $11 billion of the $30 billion, including the Reserve Bank capital buffer of $8.8 billion. Of course, that is money that would come out of the budget at some point because the Reserve Bank reserve fund needed to be replenished either at that point of time or in the future through the non-payment of dividends. There were also a couple of other issues. In particular, the Labor Party failed to pay for the redundancies they announced. They funded 800 redundancies, but they actually accounted for 14,500, and a lack of funding for offshore processing of illegal maritime arrivals. The fundamental point being this draws a line under the sand of the last year of Labor delivering a budget. They got a $30 billion, made a $30 billion error between what they promised and what was actually the outcome. I'll ask the Minister of Finance to say a few words and then go to questions.
Thank you, Treasurer. So, as the Treasurer has said, the final budget outcome for Labor's last budget shows the extent to which the previous government had lost control of the budget. When we came into government in September last year, we inherited a deteriorating budget position, a weakening economy and rising unemployment. What the final budget outcome for Labor's last budget also shows is that on coming to government, we were able to stabilise the budget position as a foundation from which to repair the budget and put us back on a believable path to surplus. So our objective in the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook back in December last year was to present the true state of the budget we inherited using more realistic assumptions than those used by the previous government, and also dealing with some of the unresolved legacy issues that Labor left behind and that the Treasurer just went through in some detail. So what you can see today is that the final budget outcome for 2013-14 is broadly consistent with our estimates in the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook and at budget time earlier this year. The constant deterioration of the budget bottom line under Labor has stopped. The position has been stabilised, which was a necessary precursor to our work to get the unsustainable spending and debt growth trajectory we inherited from Labor back under control.
Ministers, you mentioned the revenue side of the budget and the fact that the Labor figures ended up being incorrect, and you just mentioned that you think that the deterioration has stopped. What gives you the confidence that your revenue figures are looking stronger and more reliable, and what particular measures have you taken that have locked that in?
Well, I think there is an argument. I think if you get some of the fundamental forecasts right, and instead of taking a overly optimistic approach to forecasts, you take a more realistic approach to forecasts, then that ends up feeding into your underlying forecasts in terms of revenue, and we've been proven right so far in that regard. Now, there will always be one-off events or certain circumstances will create dramatic change. But as you can see, I mean, there is a dramatic change. 2 years ago, Wayne Swan promised that this year would be a surplus. It's a $48.5 billion deficit. So that is a dramatic change in 2 years, a massive dramatic change in 2 years without any single shocking event. And even before the last election, they said it was going to be a $30.1 billion deficit. It turned out to be $48.5 billion. And there had to be further write-downs in revenue. Now, there was nothing that we did that made a dramatic change to the revenue that came in the door during this year. It is simply the case that they got their numbers wrong.
And so, Laura, the proof is in the pudding. I mean, what we're presenting today is the actual outcome for 2013-14. We've gone past forward estimates and projections now. So Labor, as the Treasurer is saying, in May 2012 was still predicting a $2.2 billion surplus. By May 2013, that became an $18 billion deficit. And we know that in the 11 weeks after that, that deficit continued to deteriorate by more than $1 billion a week. And so we inherited a deteriorating position. So what we set out to do was to ensure that in our first budget update in December last year, the assumptions that we used for our estimates were more realistic, that we took into account all of the legacy issues that Labor had left behind, not providing funding for their promises on offshore processing, not providing funding for public sector redundancies, depleting the capital reserves of the Reserve Bank to an irresponsible level. So we presented our best estimate, and all of us in government, whether it is Labor or the coalition, ultimately will be tested by how the actuals compare with our forward estimates. And so that is the point we're making today. This is now the line under the sand in terms of the record of the previous government. This shows what a mess Labor truly made. It also shows that we have stabilised the situation, that we now have a foundation from which to repair the budget and get back on a believable path to surplus.
Are you preparing for write-downs in company tax revenues for this financial year?
Look, we will carefully and methodically go through the forecasts. My IFA will be published in December, and that will give the latest estimates.
And what's the impact at the moment of the big fall in commodity prices? The forecast for the budget was 6 3. The forecast for the budget is 6 3/4 fall in terms of trade. It's gone beyond that already. What's the feeling in terms of how that will feed through to your revenues?
What we're putting to you today is the final budget outcome for 2013-14. What we will put to you later in the year, as the Treasurer has just indicated, is the update of the 2014-15 budget and the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook. That is how these sorts of updates are provided.
If you're the Finance Minister, you've got a good feel for how things are flowing.
And it would be very irresponsible to provide a running commentary when, as you know, in any budget at any one point in time, there are a lot of moving parts, which is why there is an orderly and methodical process to provide updates on the budget.
Are you suggesting that Labor in office manipulated the revenue forecast, so manipulated Treasury?
Well, ultimately, the forecasts published in a budget belong to the Treasurer and the Minister for Finance.
That's it.
That's the bottom line.
But
So, you know, they look. We are always, whenever we sit down with our officers, we pepper them with questions, we test their assumptions, we go through all the appropriate processes to ensure that we are satisfied that forecasts are as robust as possible. Now, maybe the previous government didn't do that. I don't know, but they seem to get every number wrong.
The government of the day is responsible for the budget forecasts. And when Wayne Swan and Penny Wong kept getting the numbers wrong, they kept overestimating revenue and underestimating their spending. And like they can run as far as they like, they won't be able to hide from their responsibility. And we are taking responsibility the same way, and we will stand by how we perform against our forecast.
You don't think Treasury had any responsibility?
Keep going. That's 3 in a row, David. You don't go. We'll just go.
Is this definitely the line in the sand? Because I'm sure you said some words similar to this at my EFO, and we've got 6 months on the budget under your governing. Is this definitely
This
the line?
is the final budget outcome for 13-14. So these are actual numbers. These aren't forecasts. These are numbers.
Well, 9 months of this budget.
Well, we wish we could turn everything around in a matter of milliseconds, but
Between my EFO, it's 47 billion, and now it's 48 and a half.
Hang on. So let's be very clear on this, right? Like, so under Labor, the budget position deteriorated by more than $1 billion a week from the budget in May 2013 to the economic update in August. What we said when we came into government is that the deterioration was continuing. We did draw a line in the sand in MyEFO, and we predicted 47 billion at that time. In the budget in May this year, that was updated to 49.5. We came in halfway in between at 48.5. Now, I got to say, I mean, if the previous government at any one point in time, over a 9-month period, had been able to have the actuals come in that close to forecast, I mean, they would have been celebrating in the aisles, I'm sure. Wayne Swan and Penny Wong never had that particular capacity.
you're on
This
here.
is it.
Okay.
This is the final line of the.
Well, this is Labor's final budget.
Yep. Okay.
Treasurer, you say these, the government must take responsibility, the government of the day needs to take responsibility for these numbers. Of course, at that time, Labor was saying to us, well, these are Treasury forecasts. They're our best forecasters giving them to us. Aren't you in essence saying that the Labor government exercised or flexed these numbers to suit its political purpose at the time?
Well, we know they tried to do that in relation to a surplus. They kept claiming they were going to deliver a surplus. They never delivered a surplus. Then they were so bold as to claim they actually had delivered a surplus, publishing material in their own electorate saying they had delivered surpluses. Come on. I mean, these guys promised surpluses. They never delivered them. This is their last budget outcome, the second biggest deficit in Australian history in dollar terms.
We were never getting the numbers from Treasury
Well,
forecasters
they'll-
at all. We were
well,
getting
that-
Labor's figures.
You know what? That is their issue.
And let's just be very clear, Labor is all over the place with this, because at the time they were hiding behind Treasury when, as the government of the day, they were responsible. And the other week we had Chris Bowen coming out, no, we don't want Treasury to provide the information on budget forecasts anymore. We want the Parliamentary Budget Office to do it. I mean, Labor are making it up as they go. The truth is the government of the day is responsible. We are taking responsibility. We have drawn a line in the sand under Labor, and we are repairing the budget.
So overall,
Okay, just a couple of other questions.
So overall, I understand what you're saying about MyEFO, but overall, you're still confident that you'll be able to reach your surplus targets over the next couple of years, despite falling iron ore prices and despite the costs of incursions in the Middle
Laura,
East?
there are swings and roundabouts. There are, literally hundreds of decisions that are going to be made between this point in time and 2 or 3 years down the track. The bottom line is...
Your policy goal is still to reach
Absolutely. Our policy goal remains we have to get back to surplus and start to pay down the debt. David, last one.
Which month can we expect my increase?
I said December, yeah. And that's because, as I said at the press club last year, I want us to have the most up-to-date data. This is another good example. I mean, it's much better to have the September quarterly accounts feeding into MyEFO so that you got more accurate data in MyEFO than to do what the previous government did and mix it around in time and actually end up on the economic data from the previous financial year, which has perhaps little bearing on what your updated forecast should look like.
Just a quick one. Following the G20 meetings at the weekend and with the IMF coming up, are you concerned about the health of the global economy, global growth? Are you seeing greater headwinds coming at us from the sort of global trends as they were outlined at the weekend?
There are significant global challenges, but they can be beaten. They can be beaten. Germany is obviously facing some new headwinds, but the German government, which has been fiscally prudent over a extended period of time, does have the capacity to address that in the short term. It is also the case that even though China is facing some challenges, particularly in the property market, I think China can overcome some of those challenges, and it has the strength of leadership and the policy initiatives that give me confidence that China can, meet its growth target or near its growth target. Later this year, I'll be visiting Japan on the way to China for APEC. I'm looking to have further engagement with Finance Minister Aso about the Japanese economy. In 2 weeks, back in Washington for the IMF and World Bank autumn sittings, and also for the G20 again in Washington in 2 weeks. We'll get a further update as well.
Senator Corman, is it embarrassing that the banks have asked for more regulation given what you've done with FOFA?
Not at all. What we're doing with FOFA, of course, is get rid of unnecessary and costly red tape, which just pushes up the cost of advice for investors saving for their retirement, managing financial risks through life. And we have kept all of the consumer protections that actually matter to consumers now, such as the requirement for advisors to act in the best interest of their clients, and also the ban on conflicted remuneration for financial advisors. Now, when it comes to professional, ethical and educational standards, the government has said all the way through that we, of course, support further efforts to keep lifting professional, ethical and educational standards. We are working with the industry to do that in the best possible way, because the objective ought to be to make progress in this space in the way that is as efficient, as possible, so that we don't keep pushing up the cost of advice. Now, the Financial Planning Association, the Association of Financial Advisors, the SMSF's Professional Association, all have done some excellent work in recent years, lifting professional standards, lifting ethical and educational standards. So we support that work. We are also progressing right now an enhanced public register of financial advisors, which will provide transparently available for consumers information about advisor credentials, advisor status in the industry and so on. That is a sensible way forward. And we are supporting the work of the Parliamentary Joint Committee, which is looking at further measures to make improvements in this space. What I would say in relation to the proposal that was put forward by the Financial Services Council is that I don't expect anyone to put up the white flag when it comes to providing leadership in the industry themselves about lifting professional, ethical and educational standards. I expect the Financial Services Council to join others, like the Financial Planning Association, the IFA, Inspire and others, in providing leadership to the financial services industry on lifting professional, ethical and educational standards. I don't believe that another layer of bureaucracy on top of the regulatory arrangements that are already in place through ASIC in particular is appropriate. Now, I've indicated that to the Financial Services Council directly. What I'm interested in is working with all stakeholders to lift professional, ethical and educational standards in the most efficient way moving forward, recognising the work that's already been done. But I don't want anyone to say that we can't do better, even within the regulatory arrangements that are currently in place. To say that somehow the FSC doesn't have the capacity to provide leadership in this space themselves as well, I think is a cop-out.
One more on growth, if that's all right. So there were reports over the weekend that domestically you view changes to the industrial relations system as a way to boost growth. How much change do we need in industrial relations to get the kind of growth you're looking at?
Well, I wasn't the source of that report. Yeah.
Just on FOFA, will you bring on the legislation on FOFA this afternoon in the Senate?
Well, no. The short answer to that is no, because our priority on Thursdays in the Senate, for those of you who are across the intricacy of the Senate, is actually a non-government day in the main. Our priority today in the Senate, as I understand it from our leadership team, is to deal with the national security legislation. The improvements to the future financial advice laws is on the list, but I would expect that it'll come up sometime next week.
Thank you, everyone.